From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Ted Widmer. I'm the brand new director of the Kluge Center, and I just want to briefly welcome you before turning the real introduction over to Nancy Gross. I'm so new, in fact, that I saw a poster announcing this talk, and I wondered if I could sneak away from the Kluge Center to attend it because it was so compelling, and I didn't fully realize it was a talk being hosted by the Kluge Center. So I'm really glad to be here in both the capacity of new director and a very interested participant. I'm also thrilled to have learned, I just met Cheryl yesterday, and I'm enjoying meeting people from all around the world in the various divisions of the library, but particularly within the Kluge Center. And Cheryl and I, as we talked, realized that on the Earth, this very large planet we all inhabit, she and I live about 4 streets away from each other in Providence, Rhode Island. Rhode Island is so small, we often don't even use street names. And she said, I live near the pharmacy where you can buy wine. So I'm delighted to meet a new hometown friend hundreds of miles away from where we both live. But before Cheryl begins, I want to ask Nancy Gross from the American Folklife Center to do the real introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to the Library of Congress. Today's event is being sponsored, co-sponsored by the Kluge Center and the American Folklife Center. My name is Nancy Gross, and I'm one of the staff folklorists at the American Folklife Center. On behalf of my center and Ted Widmer and his colleagues here at the Kluge Center, I'm delighted that you're able to join us here today for a presentation by Cheryl Katzkowitz. Dr. Katzkowitz is a Rhode Island-based ethnomusicologist who was recently awarded a prestigious John Kluge Fellowship to pursue her research here at the library. Now, one of the great things about receiving a Kluge Fellowship is that the award allows scholars from throughout the United States, really throughout the world, to come to the library to pursue their research at the world's largest research facility, and to take advantage of the strengths and resources of the library's numerous collections. At the American Folklife Center, where Dr. Katzkowitz has chosen to pursue much of her research during her residency, AFC is one of 20 specialized reading rooms here at the library. By itself alone, the American Folklife Center is the world's largest ethnographic collection. We think we have over 6 million items documenting various aspects of traditional cultures from more than 144 nations and over 800 cultural groups. Our greatest strength is, of course, our holdings in American culture and especially American music. We have more than 3,000 individual collections at the American Folklife Center, and there are many that have never been fully explored. Among these, and I should add one of the staff's favorite, is a collection of Sidney Robertson, or she was known after her marriage, Sidney Robertson Cowell, which we split between our holdings and the music division's holding. Robertson was a pioneering collector whose significant contributions to the field of folklore and ethnomusicology have long been overshadowed by her contemporaries like Alan Lomax and Charles Seeger. Therefore, as happy as we are to welcome Kluge Fellows, we were particularly delighted when Cheryl arrived to research Robertson's rich collection. And I should add, I just want to give a shout out to AFC staff member Kathy Kirst, who is here today, who has also done significant work on Sidney Robertson Cowell. But there was more than enough material for many scholars, and both Cheryl and Kathy spent a lot of time comparing notes and working together. So Cheryl Katzkowitz received her PhD in music and ethnomusicology. Well, it actually is in music with a focus on ethnomusicology, right, from Harvard University in 2011. And she's now at Brown University as a researcher, as well as an independent scholar in Rhode Island. Her research interests focus on popular, vernacular, and participatory music making in the U.S. and include both historical and contemporary practices. Her most recent book, God Bless America, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2013, presents a social history and an ethnography of the iconic Irving Berlin song. Today, she'll be presenting an overview of her current research, and I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming her for this presentation entitled Delight in What It Is to Be an American, Sidney Robertson on the Road, 1935 to 1937.
Thank you so much. I just thank you to Ted and to Nancy. It's been such a privilege to be here as a Kluge Fellow. I've only able to be here for 4 months, which when I started felt like a long chunk of time, and it just went really quickly. But I especially wanted to thank, the librarians, the archivists who I worked with. Everybody was so helpful and welcoming, and especially in the Folklife Center, Kathy Kirst and Nikki Saylor, we went out on gossiping lunches to talk about Sidney, because they've both done work on her. Todd Harvey was extremely helpful and helped me pull the audio that I'm going to be playing for you, and Nancy Gross and really everybody who helped me at the desk. They taught me how to use the reel-to-reel machines. So thank you, and thank you also to the Kluge Center, all of the fellows, the staff, really made it a really kind of once-in-a-lifetime experience. So, and also, we've had some technical difficulties, and so whatever happens, happens at this point, is how I feel. So just a note about names. Sidney, I tend to call her by her first name because she's known as Sidney Robertson Cowell. She married the composer Henry Cowell in 1941, and in musicological circles, she's known almost exclusively with her association with him. But because I'm dealing with a time before she married him, it felt strange to call her by a name that didn't exist at the time, so we're sort of time traveling, and I'm calling her Sidney Robertson. So today I'm going to focus my talk around 3 road trips that Sidney Robertson took between 1935 and 1937, during which she came into her own as a folk music collector. These trips also illuminate some really interesting history about the government's use of folk music during the New Deal, showing the power that these songs of the people were seen to hold. In one of many unpublished, undated reminiscences that I found among her papers, Sidney Robertson described the pivotal moment when she left California. Quote, "Drawn by a belated curiosity to know more of America than is visible from her pleasant California backwater, and without any conscious intention beyond some firsthand experience of the current crisis in national life, the writer drove east in the summer of 1935. The logic of such a foray by a young woman with no resources beyond her training in music and psychology, some experience in progressive education, a small car, $75, and a driving curiosity about life and people is not evident even now. The reward for risk and hardship seems ample, for she exchanged a sentimental tie to France and European culture for knowledge and delight in what it is to be an American, without at all knowing what she was about at the time." In 1935, Sidney Robertson was living in Carmel and feeling restless. In the past 3 years, she had been let go from her job directing the music program at an alternative school and had amicably divorced her husband, Kenneth Robertson, who she'd married the year she graduated from Stanford. She'd just left a job as a governess for a wealthy family in Pebble Beach and was living in an artist colony in Carmel, teaching piano and contributing concert write-ups and book reviews to a fledgling left-leaning magazine called the Pacific Weekly. As she complained in a letter to her mother that year, quote, "I get bored talking of communism and sex down here where only a few people ever talk about anything else," unquote. Her younger sister, Jean, had plans to go to the Henry Street settlement in New York, and in April 1935, Sidney wrote to the settlement house's director, Helen Hall, to offer her services in their music programs. She concluded the letter by writing, quote, "You're doing the sort of work I care most about doing, and I hope very much eventually to be able to contribute to it in some way." What might have moved Sidney to make such a drastic life change? She may have been influenced by her work at the Pacific Weekly, a left-of-center paper started by 2 veteran journalists who'd settled on the coast. The paper featured articles and editorials sympathetic to left-of-center causes and to the plight of working people. Born into a wealthy family in San Francisco, Sidney had not had personal experience with such hardships, but a book that Sidney reviewed in the Pacific Weekly seems to have had an effect on her. Writing under the pseudonym Robin Howe, Sidney reviewed Waiting for Nothing by Tom Cromer, a realistic autobiographical novel about the hard life of a vagrant traveling west. She wrote, quote, "The impact of this book is like nothing that has been written out of individual experience of the Depression. It is stark as a winter tree. No pathos, no plea, no art intervene between you and the facts of Cromer's experience, facts which make savage propaganda because you feel they cannot be borne. No conscious drama could improve on the profound violence of this book." This review was published the same day that Sidney wrote her letter to Helen Hall, which may indicate that it had a role in her decision to head east. As she later said in an interview, quote, "I began hearing about the Depression. The Depression crept over the country slowly, and in California you didn't hear about it too much. But I began hearing things and decided I was having much too privileged a life." A little over a week after Sidney sent her letter, Helen Hall wrote back to say that she would certainly be of use at Henry Street, and Sidney began to plan her first cross-country road trip. First, she had to convince her mother that driving was the best plan, even though she was in her 30s, summarizing her case over several letters. Quote, "I hate to pay out cash for a railroad ticket. One has nothing to show for it. I've never driven across the continent. June isn't a bad month. When do you suppose people drive if not in summer? And my tires are all good for the moment." And later, quote, "A transcontinental trip sounds wild, but after all, it's only the trip from here to San Francisco multiplied 20 times in various ways," unquote. And finally, "No, I've always wanted to drive and I really feel equal to it. It will be a grand lark." On June 15th, Sidney set off with a friend of a friend who was relocating to New York. Postcards that she sent regularly to her mother show that they headed south from Carmel and spent over a week on a slow tour of the Southwest before needing to pick up the pace, driving the long stretch from Colorado to New York City in just 5 days. From Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, she wrote, quote, "We're 189 miles from NYC, a mere nothing to us, such perfectly beautiful country." Sidney landed at the Henry Street settlement on Manhattan's Lower East Side on July 4th, 1935, and began work in its social music program. Settlement houses were set up in urban areas to offer social services and activities that were intended to have an assimilating effect on the immigrant communities with which they worked. Music had been used in settlement houses since their inception along 2 separate tracks. Music schools taught conservatory-style lessons in Western art music as a mode of uplift through high culture, and social music programs offered participatory music to people of all skills and backgrounds, with the express purpose, according to scholar Shannon Green, to, quote, "ease relationships among members of the community through music." In particular, these social music programs used folk music that immigrants had brought with them from their home countries in order to strengthen a sense of community and ease communication between different ethnic groups living in the same neighborhood. As part of her work at Henry Street, Sidney collected Yiddish songs from the older members of the Jewish community to teach back to everyone in group singing programs that she led. In the end, Sidney spent just 8 months at Henry Street, leaving in March of 1936 after she fell ill with bronchitis. But as we shall see, her time in the settlement house proved to be good preparation for her government work. In the summer of 1936, Sidney joined the music unit of the Special Skills Division in the Resettlement Administration. This agency was tasked with resettling those whose livelihoods had been destroyed by the Depression onto newly created homesteads, with a stated goal to, quote, "put houses and land and people together in such a way that the props under our economic and social structure will be permanently strengthened," unquote. Homestead residents were a mix of farmers whose land had failed, jobless urban workers willing to return to farming, and unemployed miners and other rural workers whose jobs had disappeared. The guiding principle behind these resettlement communities was to foster a cooperative spirit that would do more than simply boost morale during tough times, but would, in fact, inspire a move toward cooperative farming and a new sense of collective purpose. According to a 1935 memo written by a staffer named Catherine Kellogg, the goal of the agency's Special Skills Division was to provide recreation opportunities to, quote, "bind the homesteaders into harmonious social units, to maintain and build up morale, and to relieve the strain of insecurity until economic stabilization had been accomplished." These goals seem to echo the settlement house's use of social music to unify a community, and in fact, Catherine Kellogg had herself previously worked at the Henry Street settlement and her recommendations for special skills seem to reflect this familiarity with the settlement movement's ideas. The music unit sent musicians to several resettlement homesteads to provide opportunities for social music making, and they also followed the settlement house practice of collecting folk songs to teach in the community. But here, instead of Yiddish songs from the old country, the Special Skills Division focused on collecting folk songs from the rural areas where most resettled homesteaders came from, with the express idea to put this music to work, quote, as an integrating social force, unquote, on the new homesteads. After persuading the government to purchase recording equipment, which was no small feat, the music unit began sending specialists on recording trips to collect songs that would then be brought back to resettlement homesteads to be used in community singing. The music unit was led by Charles Seeger, a musicologist and composer who'd previously worked within the Radical Composers Collective in New York City. After Sidney had worked in the Washington office as his assistant for 2 months, she was sent on her first road trip in July 1936. According to her report, she was sent to Western North Carolina to, quote, get training and experience in running the recording machine and in the rough and tumble of folk song collecting, under the wing of a veteran in the field, John A. Lomax. Sidney's traveling companions on this trip were 2 of the eminent folk music collectors of the day. John Lomax, who'd recently been appointed the honorary curator of the Archive of American Folk Song here at the Library of Congress, represented the public sphere and was considered a pioneer in the recording of American vernacular music. On this trip, Lomax was joined by Frank C. Brown, a professor at Duke whose focus on discovering survivals of Old English ballads in the songs of the rural Appalachians represented the dominant interest for academic folklorists. The first part of the trip was spent visiting Dr. Brown's ballad singers in the rural mountains near Blowing Rock, North Carolina, followed by a visit to a prison in Boone, North Carolina, where Lomax recorded songs sung by African American prisoners. Sidney then went on alone to meet the rest of the Special Skills Division staff at the Folk Music Festival in Asheville. While Sidney was on this trip, Seeger noted in a memo to a supervisor that her experience with these 2 collectors, quote, reveals a flair for diplomacy, unquote. Sidney's description of the trip in her own report shows that she was adept at navigating the large personalities and egos of her companions. Quote, I survived 2 days of 14 hours each and one of 17, the driving of Messrs. Brown and Lomax, their outrageous manners to each other, and the constant necessity for impeccable behavior toward the mountain people, our hosts. Once Mr. Lomax recovered from the notion that a woman is a fragile thing to be weighted on hand and foot, I was able to relieve him with the driving and recording and lugging odds and ends about, recharging batteries, etc. I took notes for Dr. Brown, exclamation point, regularly from the beginning. Reading about this trip, one can imagine that these men, both born in the previous century, didn't quite know what to do with a woman like Sidney. Lomax found it difficult to allow her to help, and Brown could only view her as filling the traditional role of secretary. But Sidney wrote that Lomax did, quote, make every effort to divorce himself from the machinery so I could have a shot at it. And she noted with pride that he, quote, ultimately offered to leave his machine in my hands, so I gather he felt sure I could use it properly. In addition to honing her diplomatic and technical skills, the trip seemed to help Sidney carve out her own path in developing methodology for fieldwork. In a memo entitled Observations on Technique of Collecting, written just after the trip, she wrote, quote, I came to the conclusion that the collector's visit to make records should be a social occasion, never a business one. She disliked the way Professor Brown seemed to push his singers to recall songs, noting that, quote, a collector is, after all, in the position of one asking a favor, and he should be alert to the fatigue of singer and player and return another day if necessary, unquote. Sidney later said that she was troubled by Lomax's treatment of the African American singers from whom he collected, calling it domineering and patronizing, though this actually went unmentioned in her original report from 1936. Her response to all of this seems to have been to frame her own relationships with her informants on friendlier, more egalitarian terms, though her written descriptions could sometimes hint toward a kind of detached ridicule. For example, she wrote of one of Professor Brown's singers, quote, a man in his 40s who had but one snag tooth left in his head sang for us, in a wobbly falsetto, which Dr. Brown said was the old mountain way of singing. It sounded to me as if he were simply unaccustomed to singing and unable to control his voice. Over time, she became less prone to caricature and judgment in describing musicians, but she often couldn't resist including an amusing anecdote about something they said, often written in country dialect. These stories, with a hint of ridicule while often told with a spirit of affection, are also manifestations of the cultural and economic divides that existed between collector and musician. This trip also helped clarify her understanding of the kind of music the Special Skills Division was interested in. Their goal was very different than that of academics, who were focused on capturing and classifying remnants of a static history rather than on the role of music in contemporary life. As she wrote, quote, "Dr. Brown's classifications of folk songs doesn't give us the faintest idea, the faintest hint along the lines that are important to us. What are people singing now? What are people singing most? Where is the live current as contrasted with the antiquarian one? His whole contact with contemporary life is that of a man with his head over his shoulder toward the imagined perfections of the past," unquote. Sidney expressed strong feelings about the importance of their work in framing folk music as a living tradition that held value in and of itself, as she concluded in a poetic tone not usually associated with government reports. Quote, "And here we are, struggling to make our way into the main current of contemporary culture, which we conceive as dynamic and alive, drawing its force from 1,000 tributaries which flow forward with a perpetual meeting of the waters. In the future." The Resettlement Administration's interest in the social use of music set them apart not only from academic folklorists, but also from other public folk music collectors like John Lomax, whose goals were focused on preservation and dissemination. Charles Seeger wrote that the music unit's main concern should be, quote, "to regard music as a social function, to direct it towards certain definite social goals as an activity of masses of people, rather than merely of isolated individuals." In other words, the music unit emphasized group singing and other group musical activities to reinforce the Resettlement Administration's goals of fostering cooperation, and they felt that the folk songs that already resonated with the homesteaders' rural American identity served as the best vehicle for this message. I should note that in many ways the music program followed the racialized thinking of the time and the systemic racism of the Resettlement Administration, whose homesteads were strictly segregated, with only one community set aside for African Americans. Thus, the music unit sought music from white rural musicians for the most part, with the unfortunate effect that their definition of American music focused around these traditions. And this even as the music they recorded complicated this binary, with lots of crossovers that I can detect between black and white musical traditions, but that's a discussion for another time. In a series of song sheets that Charles Seeger produced to be distributed in the homesteads, sorry if you can't see those, several songs with specifically cooperative messages were included, including "Cooperation is Our Aim," which is the top one, and includes the co-op symbol of the two trees, and "We Ain't Down Yet," which is the second one, and you can see in the art it has the sign pointing to cooperate. And this art was done by Charles Pollock, who was Jackson Pollock's brother. And the other, there's so many things to say about this. They issued, I believe, 8 song sheets, and none of them had the resettlement logo. None of them said where they were from. Also a discussion for another time. So they also used well-known folk songs with rural themes, and in the case of a song like Wayfaring Stranger, they also used well-known, music unit staff wrote new words meant to resonate with the lives of homesteaders in rural areas. So here it says, "The following modern verses from Virginia and Florida, respectively, have been received." So the 2 verses on the top from Virginia were from Charles Seeger in Washington, D.C., which I guess they decided was close enough to Virginia. And the 3rd and 4th verse were from a music specialist who was working in Florida but was from New York City. So really fascinating. So what I'm hoping to do is to play a recording that the unit made of Sidney singing these last 2 verses with Charles Seeger on the guitar, but I don't know if it's going to work.
I'm just a poor and lonesome traveler behind a mule that's powerful slow, creaking on to death and worry, the only place that I can go. My father lived and died a farmer, reaping less than he did sow. And now I travel in his footsteps, and knowing less than he did know.
Given her wealthy background and urban life, these lyrics could not have resonated with Sydney's own experience, but she may have identified with the romantic idea of a lonesome traveler after venturing out on her own to collect folk songs. Sydney was sent on her first solo recording trip in November of 1936. Originally, the collecting was to be made on the way to a new assignment as a music representative in the migrant camps in California, driving cross-country along what Charles Seeger called the Broadway of America, leading through Tennessee, Arkansas, etc. Along the way, she planned to visit several resettlement homesteads in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Tennessee, and she made connections with a network of local folk music collectors who pledged to help her find musicians in their area to record. Sydney's Resettlement Administration collection is not widely known outside of folk music circles, but when it is discussed, it is usually in connection with her work in the Ozarks. She was among the first to collect folk songs from that region, from musicians like the Danoon family shown here. And she also held 2 separate recording sessions with Emma Dusenberry, an elderly blind woman from rural Arkansas who's legendary among folk music collectors for the astounding number and range of songs in her repertoire, and John Lomax had collected from her earlier. Here I'll just play an example of their session together, which shows a bit of the warmth that Sydney tried to cultivate in her recording sessions.
Bounce a sibling to die, link to die, link to die day. Bounce a sibling to die, link to die, link day. Hamalingo, here we go, hamalingo, here we go, hamalingo, here we go, to die, link day. Gentlemen in motion to die, link to die, link to die day. Gentlemen in motion to die, link to die, link day. Hamalingo, here we go, hamalingo, here we go. Hamalingo, here we go, to die-link-a-day.
And that was a play party game, which Sydney often was looking for as a kind of representative of music that was being used in the community. And I should just say the other aspect of her Ozarks collecting is that there seems to be a love story involved that I'm not going to have time to talk about, so you'll just have to wait for the HBO miniseries. So what I am going to focus my discussion of this trip on is her collection of labor protest songs, which went largely unmentioned in her official field reports, but are hidden in plain sight in the recordings themselves. In making plans for recording sessions during her trip, she confided in a letter to a special skills staffer, quote, "Of course, the thing I'm most anxious to get on the whole trip are contemporary worker songs," unquote. Just a few days before she left Washington, Sydney met with the Director of Education for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, who gave her a list of union contacts across the country. In a confidential memo about the meeting, she noted that the union's education staff traveled the country with portable record players, playing union songs to get people to sing. Seeing a clear connection between the labor union's musical programs and the goals of the Special Skills Music Unit, she concluded, quote, "Here is music as a social tool being consciously used with a very clear aim in view," unquote. Of course, all of this interest in labor songs had to be kept below the radar. The Resettlement Administration was already under fire from lawmakers who felt it was too costly and veered too close to communism and its goals. Presumably, any music program within the agency would have been seen as frivolous, but one invested in labor songs could seem downright dangerous. In fact, the entire music unit kept an extremely low public profile. The unit was not mentioned in the Special Skills Division's annual report, and many of their memos and reports detailing their program were marked confidential. Sydney left Washington on November 7th, her car loaded with 250 pounds of recording equipment and blank aluminum discs, and headed to the Westmoreland Homestead's near Greenburgh, Pennsylvania. Her first recording session was delayed by technical difficulties, first by car trouble, then because of malfunctions with the recording machine. In talking to a radio repairman, she learned that many electrical disturbances in a small town would interfere with the machine, and because of this complication, she had to cancel the next session as well. As she wrote in her report, quote, "A little before 11, a bakery nearby started up its electric dough mixers, and the intermittent disturbance made recording impossible." Finally, the next day, she was able to conquer these technical barriers to make her first solo recording of a man with the wonderful name of Tink Queer, a fiddler accompanied by 2 guitarists, perhaps exactly the kind of music she had expected to find. So here's an excerpt from the end of one of the songs, and then you'll hear Sydney's voice at the end.
The first tune on this side is the Mississippi Sawyer. The second one is Old Sharon. On the other side are Bully of the Town, Golden Slippers, and Turkey in the Straw, in that order. They were all played at Ligonier, Pennsylvania, on November 10, 1936, by Tink Queer, fiddler, Franklin Slater, and Bill Fowler, guitars. This performance was for the Special Skills Division of the Resettlement Administration. This record is not for commercial use. It will be deposited in the Library of Congress for purposes of scientific research and for the use of the United States government.
From here, she traveled across the Appalachians and recorded ballad singers, fiddlers, and banjo players in West Virginia and North Carolina. And I'm skipping so much amazing material, both in terms of the recordings themselves and also the field notes and the report in her report are, but I just couldn't fit everything in. Then she arrived at Cumberland Homesteads near Crossville, Tennessee, where she recorded her first labor protest songs. With help from Cumberland's music specialist, Leonard Kirk, Sydney set up a recording session with the Garrett family, homesteaders and musicians with a deep repertoire of songs. This is her official report from her visit with the Garretts, and it's uncharacteristically short, a straightforward list of the songs she recorded without any of the colorful descriptions or asides of her previous reports, which often went on for several single-spaced pages. And there's also no mention of contemporary labor songs being recorded here. These missing details appear in a confidential report that she sent in later, which begins, quote, "I won't again try to combine recording of labor and more orthodox songs in the same locality. It is too difficult to manage." And she later described how they kept things quiet. Quote, "I told Kirk to be careful to cover the Garretts and Phillips by being a little vague about just what I did record and by mentioning some of the old songs they know." So here's an excerpt of Sydney's recording. This is Henry Garrett singing "Strike at Harriman, Tennessee," which is an adaptation of a traditional song called "The Hills of Roane County" with new words by Herschel Phillips, recounting a recent strike at a local mill.
Strike at Harriman, Tennessee was written by Herschel Phillips. Beautiful town in the midst of Roane County. It's a town where I've always been happy to be. It's a town where there's beauty on the banks of rolling Lee. It's a town where my loved ones I always can see. For many long years in the mill we've been toiling. Our work and our labor had all seemed in vain. We organized for some well-known reason. A few months later was called out on strike. that firm got in touch with the...
After Tennessee, Sidney stopped for brief recording sessions in Little Rock and the small town of Clinton, Arkansas, before continuing on to St. Louis. There she met up with Joe Jones, a painter and Communist Party activist who had visited the Special Skills DC office earlier that year. He had described the songs that had been sung during a citywide strike that September, after the city of St. Louis cut many citizens from its relief rolls. And Sidney wrote that she felt determined to record them on her trip. Just as in Tennessee, there's no official report describing her activities in St. Louis. And this time, even a confidential memo was too public, perhaps because of the involvement of known Communist Party activists. Instead, Sidney wrote a personal letter to Special Skills Director Adrian Dornbush and mailed it to the home of another Special Skills staff member, just to be safe. She recorded 4 full discs, about 15 different songs, sung by a multiracial group of activists who arrived throughout the day, quote, sent in by the grapevine operating among the comrades. The session had, as she described it, almost a party atmosphere, with everyone drinking beer and chatting between takes. This session seemed to convince Sidney of the power of these kinds of protest songs, as she wrote, quote, I used to be rather scornful of the tendency of radical groups to adapt a familiar song instead of writing their own, but one couldn't hear them sung as I did on Tuesday without believing thoroughly in their living quality. They are certainly not being fed from the top. She took note of one song popular among garment workers, sung to the tune of Rockabye Baby, noting, quote, the girls adore and are perfectly aware of the light irony in the contrast between the bitter words and the childlike tune.
Rockabye baby, rockabye baby on the treetop. When you grow up, you work in the shop. When you get married, your wife will work too, so that the rich will have nothing to do. Rockabye baby on the treetop. When you grow old, your wages will stop. When you have spent the little you saved, first to the poorhouse, then to the grave.
The song that she found most impressive on this trip, writing that it was alone worth the trip, was a blues-inflected chant aimed at St. Louis Mayor Dickman. She wrote, quote, this is the one thing that was sung so much at the demonstration at the City Hall, the sound rolling out into neighborhood streets hour after hour. She noted that it was set to an old blues tune, saying that the dirge-like tune was sung, quote, with a dark, patient quality of tone, monotonous and threatening, so that my scalp tingled.
The Dickman song. Dickman, oh, when do we eat? Dickman, oh, when do we eat? Dickman, oh, when do we eat? We are so hungry now. Dickman, oh, where shall we live? Dickman, oh, where shall we live? Dickman, oh, where shall we live? We have no home no more.
From St. Louis, Sidney went to Springfield, Missouri, where she was told that her assignment in California did not go through and was called back to Washington. After 2 happy weeks spent recording in the Ozarks, she returned to D.C. in January 1937, having traveled more than 4,600 miles and collected 85 discs of material to deposit in the Library of Congress. But this first solo trip would be her last official trip for the Resettlement Administration. By the time Sidney was back in Washington, the Resettlement Administration had been absorbed by the Department of Agriculture, and the Special Skills Division lost its support. As funding for the music unit dwindled, Sidney received a new assignment as a community manager at a homestead in Austin, Minnesota. Though there was no musical component to her job there, she held on to the Special Skills recording machine and collected folk music on the side, this time including the music of ethnic immigrants, the first collector to do so and call it American. In the fall of 1937, she left Minnesota and returned to California, where she would go on to direct the California Folk Music WPA project. So, if the Resettlement Administration's music program lasted just 2 years, and Sidney Robertson was involved for even less than that, why does this story need to be told? one might ask oneself after spending 4 months in an archive. For one thing, Sydney's contributions to public folk music collecting and to the academic field of ethnomusicology in the US are often overlooked. If Charles Seeger is seen as a major figure in both of these arenas, then Sydney's role should also be recognized, since she was the one who tried out his collecting methodologies in the field and participated in his efforts to value the social role of music within a culture, an idea that was transformative in many ways. There's also certainly an important legacy in the recordings themselves. Sydney's recordings are not as well known as those recorded by Alan and John Lomax, largely because she did not share the Lomax's drive to make her discoveries available to a wider audience. Perhaps Sydney needs to be recognized as at least the kind of godmother of the folk revival. She certainly seems to have had an influence on Mike Seeger, Charles's son and Pete's stepbrother, who recorded many of the songs she collected and later wrote to her, quote, "I'm very thankful of your field collecting in the 30s and remember your visits, which were always a special family occasion." And why focus on these more obscure labor songs rather than finding lost musical gems in her recordings? Well, I am fascinated by the Special Skills Division's covert use of music on the resettlement homesteads. I think it's a really interesting moment to explore when a US government agency showed a belief in the power of music and acted on it in a way that I think would be surprising to many Americans. And I think this official embrace of folk songs as representing national identity, while problematic and complicated in many ways, did have a lasting impact on our musical lives. In an oral history interview, Adrian Dornbush, the director of Special Skills, said that the division's folk music activity, quote, "is the one tangible thing that we did in the Special Skills, which has really lasted and boomed." Many studies of the Resettlement Administration focus on its failures, which provide lessons and warnings about overreaching government programs. Recently, though, scholars have begun to look more kindly on the administration's legacy. Historian Robert Leininger points out that many homestead communities still exist and even thrive, like Cumberland Homesteads in Tennessee, which has now become an upscale suburb. Within the visual arts, the photography unit of the Resettlement Administration, renamed the Farm Security Administration in 1937, is recognized as having a profound and lasting legacy, both in the photographs that were created and in the later careers of the many talented photographers it supported. Through my study of Sydney's collecting during the Resettlement Administration, I hope to illuminate a musical legacy as well. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah? Sure.
So thank you for this super interesting presentation. I had 2 questions.
Okay.
I was really fascinated by the contrast and approaches that you mentioned that Sydney took versus those who were training her to teach recordings. And I wondered if you found any information on how she sort of made her, what were her selection criteria? Like, did she make any effort to see these like performances of these songs, or like to visit labor sites where people might be using them, like in the social context where they would have been used? And then a second sort of related question is if you think that these collection efforts have had any effect on shaping the canon of, or what effect might they have on shaping the canon of American folk music?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, she was still carving it out in many ways. What she talked about is, so part of what she did is she would meet with like a local folk music collector who knew the region, and that person would take them to the singers that person knew about. And so she was often sort of dependent on those filters. Sometimes she would just go and set up, like she set up in a grocery store, in a rainstorm and collected some songs. But what she said is that often it would be, they would be talking to, she said this about Frank Brown, that he was really focused on what the older people were singing, and she would try to talk to the kids and things like that. But that being said, she often got kind of sucked into especially when she was in North Carolina and other parts of the Appalachians, the sort of excitement of finding these old ballads. And so even though she did try to set herself apart, she was still collecting those things. But as in terms of like what the Resettlement Administration was interested in and wanted to use, yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of it was not a strategically planned thing, and that I think is part of what she was good at, was sort of finding her way, showing up in a town, asking if people knew singers, and kind of seeing what she found. And then for your second question about the canon, I mean, I've been thinking about that a lot, and one of the things that I started doing was tracing songs that, like Mike Seeger's songs that trace themselves back. Another place to look is Ruth Crawford Seeger, who was Charles Seeger's second wife, put together songs, folk songs for children, and she thankfully noted who collected what. And so she was another person who you can see kind of remnants of her songs in there, and songs that I'm familiar with because of that. But it's hard to trace those lineages. I think, you know, this idea, because she wasn't as interested in putting things forward. I mean, in the hands of another collector, we might all know about Emma Dusenberry, for example. She might have, you know, tried to, I don't know. I mean, you know, bring her to urban audiences the way that the Lomaxes did. So that's something that I'm still exploring. I mean, I do think that it's there. And I guess the other thing is that Alan Lomax kind of came on the scene just after her, and so she ended up mentoring him in certain ways, giving him contacts for when he went to the upper Midwest, he got contacts from her and things like that. So I'm kind of trying to tease out her influence, and it's very easy to, you know, overblow it, obviously, but I do think it's there, so.
It's a very small question.
Yes.
Your first example of the music, you talked on with the backing.
Yes.
They sound like blue music.
Blues music? Uh-huh.
In fact, I don't know how this is the first time you were just listening to that music, you pass from blue music.
Yes.
So I was wondering about that influence. In relation to blue music of the 1930s.
Of the 1990s?
Not 1930s.
Oh, of the 1930s.
And then I was connecting that blue tradition to protest song, especially about walking yourself to death.
Yes, yes.
Because that tradition is also in blue music.
Yeah.
The period you cover and some of the places he went to connected to a larger international movement instigated by Mussolini and the attack on Ethiopia. So 35, 36, 37, in all those small communities, the politics of Haile Selassie had become part of American politics in some ways. So I was wondering why she had that labor orientation, but there's no political orientation.
No political orientation. Oh. Yes. Well, I mean, this is something Kathy and I have talked about a lot. She said in an interview, I wasn't a member of the Communist Party. A lot of my friends were. I thought it was sort of silly the way they thought it. You know, she thought it was kind of naive. But we've talked about the fact that Sydney seems to have kind of set her. She doesn't come across as extremely political. And she kind of sets herself apart, like as an observer, almost. So what I can't tell with the labor songs is how much it was the method that the labor activists were using, in terms of using this music in this particular way to change people's minds and make them feel united, versus the actual message of Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and in terms of your blues point, I mean, that's something that, you know, kind of what I was getting at about this idea that the music complicates the binary that people try to set up about we're looking at white music, because it's when you're listening to the music, you can't pull out all of those threads, yeah, and I think, yes, but certainly the issue of race is one that I'm going to need to explore more fully. So,
Yeah, hi. Thanks for your presentation. I was looking at the labor songs
oh, archives of labor songs. Anyone in Folklife know? Yeah, I mean, is it the University of Wisconsin that has, I know that there are collections of like labor papers, and but I don't know, it's a really good question. Yeah, and I don't know if they're even tagged to be able to find them in the collection here. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing that at least the government collectors were doing. I actually don't know if that's true, if the WPA collectors were doing that as well.
And I have one more comment about your remarks about the possible reactions of communism. So people that lived through the 40s and into the 50s would find that, and that had been involved only through question enthusiasm, found it devastating to the reputations that were.
Yes, of course. Yes, right. And so, yes, it's hard to know with her reminiscences also how much of things that are interfering, or not interfering, but contributing over time, that if you asked her later, you know, I mean, that question in an interview, were you a member of the Communist Party, you know, it obviously is going to evoke lots of feelings. But it does seem that she had this kind of apolitical, even though she was writing for this very political magazine, for example, her music columns were just completely separated from that. It was just, oh, this person came and they played a lovely Schubert and then they did, you know. And I don't, so that it's again something that I'm kind of trying to like wrap my mind around about. Yes.
In working with the 1938 to 1940 WPA project, where there are many recent immigrants who recorded, Sydney recorded a lot of music from Armenians who had been through the genocide, and the songs are about the genocide. She never mentions in her correspondence or the field notes the fact of the genocide. Or she records Basques in Fresno in 1939, which is right when Franco is sort of lording it over and causing many of the Basques to go into exile and then exile. I mean, there were a group in Idaho and so on. And she, again, somehow says, well, they were very reserved, but doesn't say anything about
Why,
the
right.
fact that this might be the reason.
And I think that's part of why I was having this question about the labor songs, that it really had to do more with the technique than the, you know, what would that be, the medium more than the message, because she didn't seem to ardently like follow, you know, or express strong feelings about the ideas behind the labor movement. She was just really interested in the way that they were using music. Sure.
Also in California, period 38 to 40, she was incredibly protective of the singers. Now this is after Alan Lomax had done a lot of work and she had already done the recording of resettlement. But she would say on the recordings, and no commercial use will ever be made of these recordings. And a lot of the recordings in the card catalog that was created by WPA workers say restricted. Perfectly, you know, lullabies and love songs and restricted. And some of that, I think, contributed to people not knowing as much about her Charlie Seeger go and play some records of hers without asking her at the White House, and she was sort of incensed. But so I just wondered,
Yeah.
did I feel from that earlier period that she had that sense that she better protect this from these
Yeah.
other collectors?
Yes, she definitely talks about that, and that wasn't something I included in this talk, but there's a lot of back and forth about just how to deal with the ethics of collecting. And I think that she definitely fell on the side of privacy, or, I think that the government really did not want to look like they were exploiting people, right? If they recorded these songs, like the early recording companies were going and doing and recording songs and then making lots of money. I think that that definitely had to do with why she's not well known and why her singers aren't more well known. Because, you heard, I don't know, the sound quality was bad, but in that announcement that she made on almost every recording, she would say, it's not for commercial use. And I think that was developed by the Resettlement Administration as a way to show we're not making money on this. So, but it is something that it's really, and it changed over the course of her life. She got into fights with Alan Lomax much later, and she wrote saying, like, is there any way that I can copyright the songs that I recorded? And so I think that she kind of went through, I don't think she ever had like a clear idea of her vision of it, but she certainly was more protective, more private about her collections. So, do we have time for one last question? Sure.
It seems like a good song to leak out regardless. So first song you played out is remind me of old commercial, like those old businessmen living in the village meal of this meal and we have to do it in the village meal. Everybody does it when they use their head. Everybody's heading towards their head. That was good.
Yeah, yes, certainly. I think that was part of what the collectors were struggling with, was once you had something recorded, what did that mean? You captured it in one way, but it couldn't really be captured in other ways. Yeah, exactly. And, that's the folk tradition, so.
Folks, I think we're going to have to wrap it up, and I want to thank everybody for their patience with the technological difficulties, most especially you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.